Hello and welcome to this chess game review. Today I will cover 3 games that I played at a local chess club. Now this first game, I had the white pieces, and instead of showing games where I win, that would be unfair to the great games played by my club member opponents, especially this game played by Mike, who is a strong player, and I pretty much got in trouble early. And let's take a look at this game. He played 90.1% accuracy, so great game by Mike, and I played 79.7, which was just not good enough here. So let's take a look. So I began with, let me turn on the analysis. I tried the hippo defense, which I've been trying to improve on that. Here, my opponent just responded with a kind of, I guess, Dutch defense setup. And so, I continue fianchetto here, aiming up towards the king side. He just develops his knight. I start to fianchetto on the other side with this hippo defense setup where you fianchetto both sides. And he plays this move, e6, which gives him options. He could develop his bishop out this way, but after I fianchetto, he decides to develop his bishop over here to counter my bishop. And the computer says this is an inaccuracy, that he should have played d5 here, but I can see why he didn't do that, because if he plays d5, it would leave an outpost maybe for my knight here on e5. So he plays g6, getting ready to fianchetto also and castle kingside. So I just continue with this hippo defense setup, and we both just continue our development here. So knights. And now we see that the computer wants him to gain space on the queen side, but he slowly just occupies the center. Right now, we don't have much space in this structure. Both of us are kind of cramped on both sides here. He has a little bit more space because of this F pawn. And I should have mentioned that at the beginning of the video. I'll be covering how to use space to win chess games in all 3 of these games. And it's pretty interesting how that extra room, by giving yourself more space than your opponent, can make all the difference. So here, I almost have the hippo defense set up, and my opponent continues to slowly build up a space advantage here in the middle and on the king side. And this space advantage will make quite a difference here in this game. So finally, I try to take up some equal space in the center, but the computer says the best move would have been to develop this c pawn and gather or gain space on the queen side instead of opening things up here on the king side, and especially with my king not castled yet. So now the computer, instead of this knight to a6 move, it likes f4 here better, gaining space on the king side. But the only thing about that, if that move was played, let's take a look at it here. If we go back, if f4 was played, the best option is to capture and then a recapture, and then you just go ahead a pawn here. And it looks like the computer says the best move, which, I don't know, this is kind of tricky. The best move, the computer says, is to just retreat your knight, or even to go forward and play h5, which looks crazy because, while your knight, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. you could exchange off, so that's why you're able to go knight to h5, the discovered attack on the bishop. So, I guess that is an option. But I don't know, at this point, you're just down a pawn. We could take a look at this. Knight to e8 or h5. So, I don't know, we can look at that. They recommend capturing here. And then just recapturing with the knight. And then this knight is under attack. And then white just goes up a pawn. Anyway, I can see why my opponent didn't play that. So I better move along here if I want to go over and do a review on 3 different games. So a3 is played, and we finish this hippo defense setup. Although a lot of times a3 is played before you push this center pawn. So now capture. I recapture with the knight, and the computer likes that best. Recapture, and pawn captures. So, I don't know. Here, I guess I've succeeded in keeping the space equal here in the center, although I only have 1 center pawn to Mike's 2 pawns here in the center. Although this one is backwards, the computer does give a slight edge to black at this point. So saying knight to c5, attacking this pawn, is the best move. But my opponent, let's see, actually he plays that move, and now the computer's saying bishop to e6 would have been better. And that after knight to c5, now white has a slight advantage. So, continuing on, I play b4, a mistake. So, I don't know, I guess I was thinking I'd just chase this knight, but, I should have looked at after knight to a4, he's attacking my bishop, which is what happened in the game. So instead, I should have played just queen to d2. And then I would have an option to maybe castle on the queen side in the future, although I'd have to do something about this pawn. Which could be snatched up by a rook, or I could just go ahead and castle on the king side. Alright, so in the game I make this mistake, and now the game has jumped in black's favor, so a bad move here. The best move is to attack the bishop, and now bishop to c1. Looks like that is the best move. And my opponent responds with bishop to e6, just developing a bishop to a nice square in the center. And I castle. The computer says that's best. And now we have bishop to c4, pinning this knight to the rook. But it looks like the computer prefers rook to f7 here, bringing your rook up, maybe getting ready to move the queen and then bring the other rook over and double rooks up on this half-open f-file. So instead, my opponent plays bishop to c4, but now the computer's saying b5 here would have been a better move, maybe to protect this knight from a possible queen attack, discovered attack after this pawn moves. Let's see here. So now I play bishop to d2, another mistake here. So these mistakes are starting to pile up. Now it's almost 1.5 points, or the equivalent of 1.5 pawns of material in black's favor here. So my opponent just plays d5, the best move, gaining more space in the center, setting up the ideal pawn pair, or pawn center here. And even if I capture, he could recapture with this c pawn and still have these strong pawns in the middle. Alright, so now in the game, it looks like b5 is recommended by the computer, but I would already be behind at this point. So I move rook to e1 here, trying to break this pin on my knight by this bishop. And for some reason, the computer is recommending this b5 move pretty strong here. So now d4 is played. My opponent gains more space, and this is where the space advantage will start to show here. Really cramping my pieces and getting ready to cause problems here, and creating a possible outpost for the knight to jump in here. All right. Now the computer says that d4 is not the best move. So let's take a quick look there and see what the computer recommends. Looks like queen to b6. So this move, and then what? Bishop to e3 attacking the queen. But now you can move forward and chase that bishop away. Maybe the bishop goes up there. But in the game, we had an immediate d4. The computer says that's an inaccuracy, but black is still ahead here. So I play c3. The computer does not like that move. So c3, an inaccuracy by me. It would have been better to play knight to c1. And then we have knight to b2, attacking this queen. The queen, the only place to go is up here to g4. So at this point, black is still ahead. So because of that space advantage in the center, I'm just really cramped. My pieces are unorganized, and I'm just having all kinds of problems here. So in the game, c3, I was trying to break open the center a little bit to do something, but now my opponent just plays this b5 move, kind of keeping the space advantage equal on the queen side, and I capture in the center, trying to give myself some more room so I'm not so cramped. The computer says that's the best move, and my opponent captures here. And it looks like that's an inaccuracy, but even then, black is still ahead almost by, 1 here. So the best move, according to the computer, would have been knight to b2, immediately attacking my queen. And then where does my queen go? It looks like queen to b1, attacking the knight is best. And then we have knight to d3, attacking my rook. And attacking this pawn, so forcing me to go here. And then how would black follow up? Looks like just bring this rook up to f7, maybe getting ready to add more pressure to this f pawn. Looks like a4, trying to get some kind of counterplay on the queen side, and then e takes d4. So that doesn't look good as well. Anyway, black would just keep the edge here, be it ahead by a pawn now. So that is one way the game could have gone. So let's finish this out. In the game, if we go back a few moves here, I'm cramped in the center. He's using his extra space advantage and funneling pieces into my side of the board. I try to break open the center and alleviate some of this cramped position. I capture, he captures, so now he still keeps more space in the center, and I just finally make a blunder here. I was thinking that he had this threat of pushing the e-pawn, attacking my knight, and his bishop attacking my rook at the same time. So under this slow pressure that built up, I guess I crumbled It looks like knight to f4 would have been the best move. But even then, what do I do then? It looks like bishop to e5, attacking is recommended. And now, what, queen to g4? Or even bishop to f1 to just target one of his pieces. But, anyway, that would have been better than this move right here. Rook to c1, a blunder. Now it's 5.5 points in black's favor. So, let's see here how it continued. He just jumps in with b2. And, what does this do? My queen goes to c2. But now we have this move. Forking my queen and my knight. Here I just resigned as my position is just a mess. And, the game may have continued with queen to b1. Capture of the knight. Bishop to e3. Bishop to d4. Now black would just be ahead. And by 8 points according to the computer. Maybe I capture there, they capture. The material would just be traded down, and it would just not look too good. So, here looks like it would have been better to capture with the pawn. So why wouldn't I have done that? Captured with the pawn instead. I have doubled pawns now, which look pretty bad. But black would just be ahead by 4 points worth of material and 8 points plus 8 points according to the computer. All right, so I'll end that game there. We saw, if I go back here, we see how this extra space and my cramped position gave my opponent a good opportunity to just pile his pieces in behind his central pawn here, especially if we go back a little bit when it was in this position. And the pieces are just funneling in behind these pawns and just causing all kinds of chaos until my position just crumbled. All right, well, good game for Mike there. So now I'm going to go on and try and cover 2 more games that I just played last night. So let's take a look at those. Let me find the next one. All right, so the next game I played, let's see, it was against Paul. He had the white pieces and I had the black pieces. Hold on. I accidentally hit the wrong button. So now I have to go back to the library and find those games real quick. So give me 1 second here. All right. Chess Club game review. So Paul and Vinny will be the second game. So let me add those games. And here's the game with Paul. Now what I wanted to do was flip the board. So there we go. Paul had the white pieces and I had the black pieces. So if we look at the game review here, it looks like Paul played at 74.5%, which is still pretty strong. And I played at 80.9%. Now we see how I slowly gained an advantage here, and just held the advantage. Paul did have a chance where he was ahead here by plus 1.71, so we'll definitely have to take a look at that. And if I do, well, I don't know why I'm doing the game review. Let me just look at the analysis here. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Okay. I apologize for that, so let's continue. So Paul begins with e4. I respond with e5. So no hippo defense this time. I wanted to play, work on a normal opening. So knight to f3, attacking my pawn. I defend. He attacks with the bishop, the Ruy Lopez. So I attack his bishop and it retreats. So now I just develop my other knight, attacking his unprotected pawn. So he ignores that and castles. Because if I attack that pawn, of course, he could attack the knight and I'd have to move, and then he could pick off this e pawn. So I don't go after that pawn. I just continue developing with the bishop here. And now Paul plays d4. So the center attack in the Ruy Lopez, immediately just attacking this pawn. So what do I do now? Well, it looks like to just capture the pawn is the best move. So I go ahead and capture. And now here it looks like queen to e2 is the best response to keep the game even. But my opponent goes ahead and captures this pawn. And the computer says this is a miss, that it also likes e5 that would keep white ahead. So now the computer is saying that e5 should be played, immediately attacking my knight. But in the game, well, we could take a look at that e5 move real quick. This is what the computer likes. e5, knight jumps up to e4. Then if it's attacked by the rook, jumping over here, attacking the bishop captures, and then we recapture away from the center, because we already have this pawn in the center, and I guess we want to open up a line for our queen and our bishop. Now the knight would capture. So this is one option of how the game could have played out, after capturing here, and instead my opponent captures with the knight, which is a miss. So now the best response is to just use my knight and capture his. So this is what I should do. Capture, and then looks like either e5 once again or a recapture with the queen. But either way, black would be ahead. But in the game, I captured on e4 instead. So I played this move, which is a mistake. So at this point, Paul is winning the game. Well, maybe not winning, but he's ahead quite a bit after this mistake, ahead by 1.71. But, he would have to find out how to take advantage of this knight move, and it's pretty tricky. So, it's no wonder that it wasn't found, what he should play. I don't know if I would have seen exactly how to follow up here. So we have knight to f5 being the best move, attacking the bishop. And he could play rook to e1, attacking this knight, and then what do we have? d5, protecting the knight. Oh no, excuse me. If he plays rook to e1, then we just go ahead and capture this knight over here on d4. But instead of getting into that, let's see here. This move was played. Knight takes e4. Instead, I should have captured his knight. And now my opponent captures my knight here. And so this is a miss that swings the game back in black's favor by 1 point here. So instead, looks like knight to f5, the computer says is best, immediately attacking the bishop and this pawn. So what does black do now? If he moves up here, this move trying to cover the G pawn, which is under attack as well, well then you have this tricky queen to d5 attacking the unprotected knight. Well, now the computer says castling is the best move, because what can this knight do? Let's see. If the knight goes here, well then the bishop can capture you. If you go here to d6, the white knight can capture you. You'd have to recapture with a pawn, and then the queen would pick that pawn off, and go ahead and material there. So oddly enough, the computer recommends castling, giving up that knight. Then you attack the queen runs, you attack again, you go after the knight here. There's an exchange of pieces over here. Now the knight has time to retreat. We trade queens, doubling their pawns, and then you attack their rook, but the rook moves away. So here you're down by 2 points of material. You only have a pawn for a piece, so that's not so good. This bishop is kind of blocked in for the moment because you can pick this pawn off if it moves. What does the knight do? But anyway, you're just down material here. The computer's showing +2 in white's favor. So, that all of that would be hard to see though. So, no fault at all for my opponent not finding all of that. So, in the game, we had this capture here, which swings the game in black's favor. So we have capture, looks like that's best, queen captures is best, and here this was a little tricky. I have to be careful that I don't capture with the bishop, because then a rook could pin this knight to my king, and go ahead and material here. So, I guess I could show that to you real quick. If you play this, this would be a mistake here, because let's wait for the computer. It's having trouble catching up to this. Anyway, it's showing rook to e1, immediately pinning that knight would be a great move. If you tried to protect, well then you just have this move, attacking the knight, and you would just be behind in material here. Because the pawn would pick that knight off. So, because of that, after the queen captures here, the best move is king captures to stay ahead. And now my opponent, he goes ahead and checks me. And here, I don't play the best move. I guess it was the third best move. I retreated my knight. I wanted to kind of consolidate and bring everything in to defend my king and play some defense. But this knight is stronger in the center here, so I shouldn't have retreated it. It looks like the computer likes either bishop to d7 or even just sliding my king over here. But in the game, I just retreated my knight back, and then Paul just develops a bishop here, which is an excellent move. The computer prefers an immediate bishop to b3, maybe lining up on this pawn, which is not protected by the knight because the knight is pinned to the king. So now we have this bishop moving here to cover this pawn, although the computer likes an immediate bishop to g4, attacking the rook. Although, f3 could block that attack. All right, so an exchange here. The computer says this is a mistake. Now, why is this a mistake? So if we look at this, why do you think this is a mistake? Well, one, capturing here gives up your bishop pair. So you're voluntarily giving up one of your bishops and leaving your opponent with a bishop pair, which is strong in open positions. And this is a pretty wide open position. So 2, this also helps undouble my pawns. So, I capture back with the pawn instead of the bishop, capturing towards the center. So, first, my opponent gave me the bishop pair and, got rid of his bishop pair. Second, it undoubled my pawn. And third, I was able to capture towards the center, giving me a strong central pawn. And now I have a pawn majority. And this pawn is unopposed, so I want to start pushing my pawn majority for an endgame advantage. And while doing that, trade off as many pieces and try and use that extra pawn to win in the endgame. So now, knight to c3 is played, just developing the knight. Although the computer still likes this bishop to b3 move, fighting my bishop, wanting to trade off material, which I would probably, I'd have to be careful, because if he played that move and got ready to push his pawn, I couldn't, or I wouldn't want to play this because of this rook pinning the pawn to my king. So anyway, what do we have next? Finally, I push forward here. Computer says that's best. Pushing my unopposed pawn in this 4 pawn to 3 queenside pawn majority. And this also, one of my main reasons for pushing this pawn is also to restrict the mobility of this knight. Now the knight cannot jump into the center here, and the knight can't move forward here on b4 because of these pawns. The knight is kind of forced to retreat if it wants to then come back and move forward. So bishop to b3 finally, but now the computer recommends this retreating move, which will allow the knight to jump forward to d4 or f4 and attack my bishop. So I move my king up, trying to get my king into the action, and I went to a dark square because why put my king on a light square that the bishop could eventually attack? And my rooks are connected now, so plenty of room to figure out where I want to put these rooks. And knight to e2 is played. Although now the computer wants this move, a4. So I guess the computer can't make up its mind sometime. And the position, little changes in the position can really dictate what move should be played at any given point in the game. So you have to kind of calculate and look a little bit after each move and see what changed in the position. So now my opponent is threatening to jump his knight forward and attack my bishop here on e6. So I try to develop one of my rooks, and the computer really liked this a4 move because then we could threaten to keep pushing forward and trap the bishop, and he would have to do something about that. All right, so the knight moves forward. And at this point, I thought, okay, I'll let the knight move forward. He can go ahead and take that bishop, and I'll just trade off more material. But once again, the computer says it's best to keep your bishop pair. So that's a good lesson there. Don't voluntarily give up your bishop pair, if you don't have to, unless you get some good advantage in return. The only reason I thought it was okay to do it is because I'm ahead in material, and I thought as I trade off more material, that would help me. But we see the difference it makes by giving up that bishop. I should have kept my bishop, moved here to f5, maybe putting pressure on this pawn and keeping my bishop pair. So now he captures, of course, getting rid of my bishop pair. But it pulls this pawn towards the center, and now I have two strong central pawns. So it looks like instead of this move, rook to e1 would have been better to restrict this pawn in the center. So now, because this video is supposed to be about using space to win chess games, let's talk about space here. So I have more space in the center with these pawns, these strong pawns. It's kind of even on the queen side. We haven't moved these pawns, and I have more space over here. So my goal is to push these pawns forward and use this extra space to give my pieces more room and my king more room to move, but also to restrict my opponent's pieces. So first, I decide to put my bishop here where it can keep an eye on these pawns, but it looks like it would have been better to just jump the bishop up here to get ready to help me push my pawns forward. But I felt I could do that from this side and keep an eye on these pawns. So rook to e1, Paul finds the best move in the position, lining up on this backwards unprotected pawn. So, of course, I push that forward, gaining more space here and creating the ideal pawn center. So now the other rook is developed, but f3 looks to be the better move, which would restrict this e-pawn, because now if the e-pawn pushes forward, he could capture, and if I recapture, his rook would pick that pawn off. So f3 was probably a better move here. And now I developed my rook, but I should have played e4. And so now he finds the best move, pushing that f-pawn forward and really restricting my movement of my pawn here. All right, so I jump this rook up, getting ready to double rooks on either file here, and I made sure I kept them both on the dark squares so the bishop wouldn't harass them. But the computer says it would have been better to play h5, gathering space on the king side, and maybe preventing any pawn push to g4, where we could just pick off that pawn. And of course he could go here and recapture. But anyway, before we go off too far there, so now he moves his bishop here to a better diagonal that's unrestricted like this one. So another advantage of having space, you can really restrict your opponent's pieces and cramp their position. So now, he's attacking, so I move forward, but the computer says I should have just jumped all the way up here. But I wanted to keep these pawns on the dark squares, where if I went here, well, I guess he could not immediately play h4 and keep me stuck on the light squares. But anyway, I wanted to keep my pawns on the dark squares so the light squared bishop could not harass them. And another note, here we have opposite colored bishops going into the endgame, and that's more drawish, and if you're not careful that can lead to a draw even if you're behind a little bit, behind a pawn. What do we have here? So 6 pawns to 7. So one pawn might not be enough if we go down into opposite colored bishops in the endgame. All right, so my opponent plays this move, an inaccuracy, f4, and the game jumps to 3.37 in black's favor now. So I would say my opponent should not have done that, because that just gives up a pawn here for free. And the best move is to just go ahead and capture that pawn. All right, so let's take a look here. What should have been played? Looks like the computer, one recommendation, and here it's saying this is best, a4, just trying to trade off some material. The computer recommends b4 as a response, which is pretty interesting. I probably would just ignore this, and if he captures, I would capture towards the center, something like that. But maybe b4 is recommended. That way you don't open up the a file where a rook could swing over and try and get some counterplay. All right. So in the game, f4 was played, giving up a pawn. So we capture. The computer says even better would have been to just push forward. So, interesting there. But I thought, why not grab the material and just use that extra material in the endgame, and if we trade off rooks, that'll just get rid of more material and make it harder for him to stop my extra pawns. So, I guess we could take a look at that preferred move after f4. So e4, getting the passed pawn immediately, and really blocking the bishop out. So it looks like that's slightly better. Just e4, then g3. But we see all these pawns are on the dark squares, the same color as my bishop. But our pawns are over here, but we're really restricting his bishop. And so that's a tricky thing in the endgame as well. Knowing where to put your pawns in relation to the bishops. Usually you want your pawns on the opposite colored squares as the bishop that your opponent has, because if all of my pawns were on the dark squares, this bishop could not touch them, and it would be like a ghost moving through these pawns and not being able to touch them. But on the other side, having these pawns on the same square, as long as they're protected and they can't be broken apart and targeted immediately, then they really restrict his bishop. So here, what is recommended? It looks like, once again, it wants that b4 move. Why would it want that? Okay, if I play that and he captures, well, then my bishop could pick off his b pawn. All right, that makes sense. I kind of overlooked that bishop on f6. Okay, let's move through this so we can get this done and get to the next game, or this will be another marathon video. Okay, we have a capture here with check, so I recapture with my bishop, of course. Now he moves his rook on this nice open file, attacking my bishop. And it looks like bishop to c5 check is the recommended move. Although now it's saying bishop to f6 would be better. So the king moves because he was in check. And here I make an inaccuracy, which, I could have had a 2.85 advantage and it dropped down to 1.86. So instead, I should have jumped my bishop up to this fine outpost. So the best move would have been to jump up here on this outpost, protecting this pawn. If the pawn is targeted here, if it's captured, I could just drop back and then bring the next pawn up to protect the bishop. But in the game, I played rook to d7. So now we have this attack on the rook, and that's not the best move. That's an inaccuracy. It looks like rook to e6 would have been better, kind of jumping the rook down into the position, maybe threatening to swing over and attack these pawns, or preventing this pawn from pushing forward, because then you could pick this h6 pawn off. All right, but back to the game. Attack on the rook, and here I make another inaccuracy. I thought, well, we'll just trade the rooks off and I have these two extra pawns in the endgame, and that should be enough. But it would have been better to keep the rooks in the game, and it looks like best would have been just rook to f7, attacking this unprotected bishop, and then maybe a retreat with bishop to g4 here. All right. So in the game, we trade off rooks, and now the bishop moves back here to restrict the movement of these pawns. The computer prefers king to e2, immediately getting your king into the action, which is always important in the endgame because there's only two pieces on each side of the board, a bishop and a king. So you have to make use of what you have, and you definitely need to get your kings in the action. So see here, computer wants me to immediately start moving my king up into the action. Instead, I push this because I didn't want a future g4 move, but I didn't have to worry about that really, because if he goes here with g4, well, then I could go bishop to f6, just attacking the unprotected pawn. So king to d6 would have been better. So remember, in the end games, get your kings into the action, as long as it's safe to do so. If it's a queen endgame, you might not want to throw your king in the center of the board, or the queen might go crazy, checking you and forking and picking off pieces. All right, so I move the pawn forward. My opponent responds moving his pawn forward, which is a mistake. Better would have been bishop to e8, kind of targeting these light squared pawns from behind. But I return the favor here with a miss, pushing forward, thinking, well, maybe if he captures and I recapture, my one pawn would kind of hold these pawns in place. But better would have been bishop to f6 to just immediately move my bishop up here and target this unprotected pawn. So what does he do then? Either let me capture it or move his pawn forward, which would be best. So, something like this. Capture towards the center or away from the center. Either way works. Here you might even want to capture away from the center. Let's check that out. Because if he goes here, well, now the best move is to just push forward, and then you have this pawn majority of 2 pawns versus 1, and you could maybe try and break through in the end game. So here, now this is interesting. They recommend c5. c5 just invites you to pick that pawn off with your bishop. So let's take a look at that. Yeah, see, now it's saying that c5 is an inaccuracy. So come on, computer, you can do better than that, can't you? I don't know why it does that. Sometimes it's like it takes it a while to find the best moves here. All right, back to what happened in the game. I pushed forward. That was a miss. And now we have another mistake here. Moving the king forward, that just gives me another pawn. So best would have been to just go ahead and capture here. So capture, and then, what do I do? Capture towards the center, or actually it says that is better. Now, once again, that's an inaccuracy, and it wants this now. So it says that's better. This one pawn stops both of these pawns here. Another little strategy in the end game where one pawn can hold off 2. Now, if this pawn pushes forward, you could capture and the other pawn could move forward. But, without something else to help stop this B pawn, if you push your A pawn, it'll just capture and then go on to promote. Possibly if there's not something like this bishop to jump up here and try and stop it. All right. In the game, we had king to e2 giving up the pawn, so I just capture another pawn. So now I'm ahead. What is this? I'm ahead by 3 pawns. So I would say that was a theme of trouble in this game for my opponent is he just gave up too many pawns, and I just used those extra pawns to give me an advantage. And now I have extra space as well with these pawns. They're pushing forward, and my opponent is becoming more and more limited as to where he can move, and we'll see that here as the game progresses. So he tries to move forward here, and then I move here, although the computer likes bishop to b4 even better. But I didn't want him to attack. Then if I capture, he captures. So by doing that, which that may have been fine as well. But here we see that my opponent is very limited in his moves because this pawn is cutting off e4 and c4. This pawn is protected now, and the bishop is cutting off the king from moving forward, and this pawn is even limiting the squares that the king can retreat to, only c2 or e2. So the king retreats back, trying to hold this pawn back, and now my king moves forward. So he tries to just move up again. My king starts jumping forward into the game. And we have a bishop move here. Although the computer prefers bishop to e8, because then you can target this pawn. If my king moves forward, you can pick off the c pawn. So this was a little inaccuracy. Instead, an immediate king move to go and target these pawns would have been better. So once again, remember, your king is very strong in the endgame. Make sure you use your king. So king to b4 here would have been better. But I play g5. My opponent responds with bishop to h5, an inaccuracy. Once again, he should have moved to e8 here, targeting the c pawn. Because then, if my king tries to move forward, he could pick that pawn off. All right, so I finally move forward, and the king moves back to protect this pawn at the base of this small pawn chain here. So I push forward, and it looks like once again I should have used my king instead and marched over here, because now my opponent can capture, although that was an inaccuracy. My opponent should not have captured there. Instead, the pawn move was recommended over here on h3. So now, let's see what happens. I pick that pawn off, but the computer wants something else. So instead of picking that pawn off, it looks like I should have retreated my bishop back here where I could reposition and hold off the pawns, and maybe move over here. But anyway, we have a retreat. That is an inaccuracy. Once again, it would have been better to move to e8, targeting this pawn and pinning it to my king. So now it looks like retreating back would have been better. Interesting. So he moves over to protect this pawn. I start pushing my pawns forward. So this is targeted. I just move it forward. And now my king comes back here. The king jumps forward first. I don't want the bishop or king moving into my position, so I gain space here and slowly push my opponent back. He tries to lure me over here to capture this, and then he could capture this, but I just step back. And it looks like moving back here would have been better, but I move here. The bishop repositions, although it looks like it may be better to move over here to d1. So anyway, now I just start pushing forward. And it looks like I should have just kept on moving with those pawns, but I play an inaccuracy here. I wanted to swing over, stop this pawn. And the game ends with this here, which interestingly enough It says that's the best move. That bishop moves looks like a mistake. Well, now it's saying it's the second best move. So here it allows the fork by the pawns. And apparently that's not even the best move, to fork. Looks like g4, which doesn't make sense because with g4, well, either way, the king is slowly getting trapped or the pawns will promote. So the game finished like this. So my king moves forward, and finally we trap his king and start moving up, and we'll just run our pawn up, promote to a queen, and checkmate. So the game ended here. Computer says the game may have continued with king moves. We go here, and then we just mate. All right, well, let's jump into the final game, and I'll have to zip through that. That way I can get all three of these games in here. So, once again, my opponent, Paul, played a pretty good game, except for the pawn moves where he just gave up too many pawns. So I would say if he works on that and just tries not to give pawns away for free, then the games will be much closer, and I think he'll have more success. So anyway, remember to use space when you can to your advantage, and don't give away pawns. So that's what we can learn from this game. And the final game will look once again how space can make an advantage to help you win some games. All right, so in this game, I played against Vinny with the white pieces. So let me flip the board. Vinny played with 80.6% accuracy, so pretty good. And then it looks like I played 86. So let's check it out. Back to the analysis. All right. So e4 was played by my opponent. So once again, not a Ruy Lopez. I take that back. This is the Vienna game. So e4, e5, knight to c3, the Vienna game. So if you want to play something different, you can try this out. Knight to f6 here. Just, developing a piece, getting closer to castling. Now, Vinny just develops a knight here. And it looks like, what is recommended? The computer is recommending knight to f3. Anyway, that's what he plays, knight to f3. So here, what should I have done? It looks like I should have played knight to c6. But instead, I just protect this pawn. But now, d4 is played. And it looks like, I don't want to leave this strong pawn center. And my opponent grabs more space in the center, so I capture. And then he recaptures with the queen, which surprised me. It looks like that's still a book move that can be played. But already my opponent has more space in the center with his e4 pawn versus my d6 pawn. So I play bishop, first I play knight to c6, attacking his queen. And it says that's a good move, but a6 would have been better, or even bishop to e7 to get ready to castle immediately. But I wanted to capitalize on his queen being stuck out there in the center. So he retreats with queen to e3. And it says that's a good move if we go back here. Although now the computer changed its mind again, and that move's not even showing up. Looks like, or yes it is, it's the third best move now, queen to d3, sorry. Queen to d2, most recommended. All right, so this retreat, and the computer's now saying bishop to b5 would have been better, pinning the knight to the king. But the queen is retreating. Now we play bishop to e7. Although the computer prefers fianchettoing here, maybe g3, then bringing the bishop to g7. So my opponent continues developing his bishop here, attacking my knight. I castle. He castles queenside. So now we're going to have an interesting game of opposite side castling. Normally, you would want to launch your pawns against your opponent's side where they have castled. So white should just launch his pawns on the king side. I should launch them on the queen side. But instead, we play a different game where we kind of try and use our space in the center to our advantage. So let's see how that plays out. I play e6 here. And now we have knight to d5. My opponent tried to use this extra space with this e pawn by jumping forward, but this is a blunder. King to b1 would have been better. Now, I did not take advantage of that blunder. I play bishop takes d5, which is a miss. So the game was over 1.5 in black's favor after this knight move, because I should play knight takes d5. And I looked at that, but not closely enough. I thought if knight takes d5, well, then he can recapture with the pawn and fork both of my pieces. But I should have realized there was a possible capture with check here, so it's a little complicated. So we'll take a look at that. So first off, what he should have done was king to b1. But instead of capturing with my bishop and losing my bishop pair, I should have captured with the knight. And then it shows e takes d5 is best, because I thought also he could capture like this, attacking my queen and rook. But here it looks like knight. Oh, my knight would just recapture here. Something like this, and then I'm just ahead a whole piece here. So that's why that wouldn't work. All right, so back to this knight move. I should have captured with my knight. So after his blunder of a knight move here, I should have captured instead of using that bishop. I should have captured with the knight. And then his best option is to take with the pawn, forking the two pieces. But then I should capture with check. The knight would capture. I capture with the queen, check. And then queen blocks. Capture. Rook captures. Keeping this fork alive here. Then bishop to d7, capture, pawn captures. And then we would just be ahead one pawn, which I believe is what happened in the game anyway. So let's take a look. So back to the game. Knight jumps forward. We capture with the bishop. They capture our knight here. We capture attacking their queen. So an inaccuracy there. Better would have been what? Capturing here. And I briefly looked at this, but I thought, well, at some point, he could capture here and then trap my bishop. So the computer gives a retreat here. Okay. So what if he goes here? It recommends, of course, me recapturing. And now, let's look at this trapping move. Does that even work? If we have something like that, well, it looks like that would be a mistake, because we have a5 here. Okay. Well, what if the king goes up here and tries to pick that off? Well, then we have a4. Okay. Now, if the king picks that off, what do we have now? Oh, this fork. Oh my gosh. Yep, we have a fork here. Okay, so some deep tactics. Well, not too deep, but some interesting tactics. And I didn't really want to go into those complications. So, anyway, let's go back here. So, after the blunder move, I capture with the bishop. They capture there. I attack the queen. What did it say? All right, so that's the second best move, and it keeps black ahead. So I attack the queen. He attacks my queen, which is a mistake. Better would have been to immediately attack that bishop. So instead, we have capture. Now, the queen cannot capture my bishop. So we have that, which is the best move. So here I thought, well, I'm ahead a pawn. I might as well trade some material down. So I retreat back, but that is not the best move, and that's a mistake. Better would have been rook at f to e8 here to just line up on that queen. And then it looks like, what's their best move? To just go ahead and attack with their bishop. All right. Well, moving on. In the game, I retreat back. We have a trade of queens. I capture. And now bishop to d3. And now this is a mistake. Knight to d4. Just jumping the knight up into the center would have been better. So I trade off more material. But rook to e8 would have been better. So we have a capture. I put my rook on this open file. They do the same. And here I jump my knight up towards the center because I need to activate this knight for the endgame. And they double their rooks. But it would have been better to capture here, it looks like. So, at this point, I should immediately capture his rook. But instead, I bring my king towards the center. Now the computer's saying that's the best move. So the knight jumps down here, threatening to take this pawn with check. And so if I move my king, because I can't move this direction because of the rooks, I'd have to move my king back and attack his knight. And then he might have an opportunity to start picking things off here. Picking off a rook. If I recapture, he picks off a rook, and he would go ahead, a rook and a pawn, and all he would get, or excuse me, all I would get in return would be his knight over here. So I had to watch out for that, and because of that, I captured, and it said, that this was a great move to avoid this trick over here with the knight. So he captures, and then I push that knight away. He retreats. We bring our rook to the open file to fight for that e-file. His king jumps up here because we're also threatening the possibility of, if that king hadn't moved to the center, we could attack the knight with the pawn, and when it moves, we could pick off this rook and maybe leave him with a open or a isolated pawn here after the pawn recaptures, another weakness. So my opponent moves towards the center to guard his rook. And here we jump our knight into the center. So we have a little bit of extra space here with this pawn. Although that doesn't count much for a space advantage yet. But in the end game, you have to activate the pieces that you have. So my opponent moves over here because there was also this threat, my threat of jumping the knight to c4 and forking the king and the rook. So he moves over here to stop my knight. And now it looks like I should immediately have pushed forward, gaining space in the center and attacking his knight. So now he moves here to fortify his unprotected knight. And I did this to keep his knight out of c5, but it looks like I should have attacked him anyway with d4. So he retreats back here, which the computer says is the best move, because from here he can reposition to e2, then jump into d4 or f4. So I start finally gaining space on the king or queen side over here. And the computer says instead I should have pushed this pawn, gaining a little bit of space on the king side, but cutting off the knight from being able to move forward. So better would have been g3. And I thought, well, the reason I didn't move that is because I thought, well, then he could still move to the center here. But, you know, what could he do if he did go there? I could still play this, you know, I have b3 here, which would cut off his movement forward. And if my king moves up, he couldn't jump forward this way. All right, so he ended up jumping forward, attacking my rook. I move over, and he repositions here. But it would have been better to move this pawn forward, it looks like, with f4 attacking my knight. My knight would have to move here with check, and then he retreats back. So we have the knight move, but now this allows me to push forward, gaining space and pushing his pieces back. So he tries to lash out, jumping forward here, but we just continue, grabbing more space, pushing his pieces back. And here, I was really trying to figure out what to do. I thought, well, you know, and I even looked at the best move, which was d4. But I thought, I don't know, he can just... I just wasn't sure if that would be the best move, because if I pushed to d4, I thought at some point his knight could jump here. But I don't know, that would have been a good move, because then he's really running out of room. And I thought if I played d4, where does his rook go? It would have to go here. It would be attacking this pawn. So let's take a look at that. d4, he has to go there. I push up to b5, and he's really running out of room. So what can he do? It looks like the computer says the best move is to capture that pawn. Give up your knight for 2 pawns. Is there anything else that can be done here? Knight to b1, just getting the knight out of there. But then you have c4, rook to a3, and then, whoa, c3. That's kind of tricky. c3, how does that even work? Oh, you threaten a fork over here. Because if capture, well, now you have a fork like this. All right, yeah, that's tricky. So, you know, instead of calculating all of that out, I thought, well, instead, I'll push this forward and really limit the scope of the pieces. But this was an inaccuracy, because now my opponent did not notice what was going on here, it looks like, and played king to e2, which is an inaccuracy. Rook to e3 immediately would have been better. So, and giving that rook room to escape. So if we take a look at that, rook to e3, now the rook can escape and not be trapped. Our knight would be under attack. Here the best move would be knight retreating back to c6. But we had Let's see, king to e2, and now I'm able to push forward, gaining more space, but more importantly, just trapping the rook. The rook can't go anywhere. So my opponent, he did play the best move. Knight takes c4 is second best, but that's not very good because then he's behind by almost 4.5 points. So he did find the best continuation. Capture, knight captures, and now rook to e7 check is the best move. But instead, I just played the second best move, I believe, b5, just attacking the knight. And now my opponent kind of goes wrong here. He plays knight to b6, an inaccuracy, which we see the evaluation jumped in black's favor here because this knight just ends up trapped. So it looks like the best move would have been what? Knight to a5, blocking this pawn. The knight can jump back here to b3 and target this pawn, which is only protected by the rook here. So it takes the king 1, 2, 3 moves maybe to jump up here to help protect this, and then 1, 2 moves. Anyway, in the game, we had this inaccuracy, which leads to the knight getting trapped. So we attack the knight, although the computer likes this pushing of d3, or up to d3 even better, which just gives up a pawn, I guess. Okay. The knight tries to attack me again, but it looks like it wants this other move here to a8. It says that's best, which that looks dreadful. Now, best would be king, bringing our king up to e7 to try and trap this knight. So the king could move over and try and trap, which, why not? Where can this knight go? Here, the rook will get you. If the knight goes here, well, then the rook still is stopping this knight. So the king's just going to march over and go after that knight. All right, so let's finish this out. In the game, we had this capture, or excuse me, this attack here. The knight retreats back attacking, and now we go here, and the knight is just trapped. So he captures a pawn. We capture. And then here, it looks like we should have immediately picked that pawn off. So we should have just gone here and started picking off these pawns with our rook instead of going after the knight. But I thought, well, let's just get rid of his last piece. And then he goes here attacking, and I thought, oh, I'll just defend and bring my king up into the action. So he started moving his pawns. We capture, he captures, and we just bring our rook over or up a little bit. Or excuse me, at this point, my opponent resigned, and the game could have gone, according to the computer, something like this. Yeah, I don't know why he didn't pick that off. The computer's acting crazy today. All right. Well, these games, they were kind of open a little bit more as far the second two games. The first game, I really got cramped in a kind of a closed, semi-closed position. But in this game, if we go back a little bit to, let's see, up in this point. So already I'm gaining space, and my opponent is running out of moves, and that kind of contributed to his pieces getting uncoordinated and trapped, like this rook here. And then we see his knight getting trapped. So you can see how the space advantage can really work in your benefit if you try and use it correctly. It can cause your opponent lots of problems and hopefully give you some extra wins in your chess games. All right, well, I better wrap this up. This is a long video. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already to support the channel. And as always, you can leave comments, suggestions, or any requests if there is some type of chess material you would like to see in the future. So thank you for watching and have a super chess day.